Section 15 of God's Terrible Voice in the City by Thomas Vincent. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Catalogue of London's Sins, 15 to 25. 15. Another sin is drunkenness. This sin hath been more visible and apparent. I believe that scarcely any nation under heaven hath proportionably more taverns and alehouses than England, and no place in England so many as London, and its adjacent parts. And of all the many thousands in these houses, I believe there hath been scarce any but could give many instances of this sin. Besides the many private houses where this sin hath been practised, how have men risen early in the morning to follow strong drink, and continued unto night till wine inflamed them, Isaiah 5 verse 11. Come ye, say they, and I will fetch wine, and we will fill ourselves with strong drink, and tomorrow shall be as this day, and much more abundant. Isaiah 56 verse 12, the corners and beds full of vomit, the reelings about the streets, the contentions and wranglings, the wounds without cause, the redness of the eyes and such like, have been too evident a demonstration of men's tarrying too long at the wine, and distempering themselves with excessive drinking. Proverbs 23 verses 29 and 30. To be overtaken with drunkenness is a great sin, which makes men more brutish than their very horses, who will not exceed their measure in drinking, except they be forced to it by barnacles. And if none in the city had yielded to receive the drench of a cup beyond the measure without barnacles upon their noses, I suppose that with their horses they would have been more sober, and hereby prevented many distempers of body, and worse distempers of mind, and, which is worst of all, much dishonour of God, as well as of themselves, which excess in this kind hath been the cause of. But for men to follow after this sin, and make it their trade and common practice, to delight in it, and seek for their God and chief happiness in a cup of wine or ale, and to grow men of might in drinking, to exceed the bounds by many degrees without reeling, to entice others to it, yea, to force them to drink healths, that ungodly practice which would not in the least promote another's health, but was likely to destroy their own, through the excess which such practices do introduce, to take pleasure in drinking down others under their feet, and after to glory in their shame and wickedness. This is a sin that doth so far exceed brutish, that it becomes devilish, and doth highly provoke the Lord to pour forth his fury like water upon the places where such sins are committed. And hath not London been guilty of this sin of drunkenness, with aggravations of it? Have not some of London's magistrates been guilty, who should have punished this sin, and too many ministers who should have reproved it both by word and example of sobriety? And for such to be seen drunk and reeling in the streets was very shameful and a great provocation. Have not the late judgments in some sort pointed out this sin, the dizziness of head and reeling of persons that have been smitten with the plague, the flaming of the heart of the city, and reeling of the houses, and tumbling of them to the ground by fire, methinks were a reproof of the dizziness and reelings about the streets and houses of such persons as had inflamed and distempered themselves with excessive drinking. 16. A 16th sin of London is perverting of justice. This is a God-provoking sin, when none calleth for justice, nor any pleadeth for truth, when men make to themselves crooked paths, and there is no judgment in their goings. Yea, when judgment is turned away backward, and justice standeth afar off, and truth is fallen in the streets, and equity cannot enter, when truth faileth, and he that departeth from evil maketh himself a prey, etc., as the prophet speaks, Isaiah 59, when magistrates are lovers of gifts, and followers after rewards, when they judge not the fatherless, neither doth the cause of the widow come unto them. Then the Lord crieth, Ah, I will ease me of mine adversaries, and avenge me of mine enemies. Isaiah 1 verses 23 and 24. I cannot charge London deeply with this sin, not having been myself present much in their courts of judicature, and I would hope that justice hath taken place here, as much as in most cities in the world. But when I read what the Lord saith concerning Jerusalem, Jeremiah 5 verse 1, Run ye to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem, and see now and know and seek in the broad places thereof, if ye can find a man, if there be any that executeth judgment, that seeketh the truth, and I will pardon it. And when withal I consider the dreadful judgments of God upon the city of London, whereby the glory of the magistracy and government of the city is so much stained, I would submit it to inquiry whether there hath not been a failure and perverting of judgment in the city, whether bribes and rewards have not blinded the eyes, and the edge of the law hath not been turned against well-doers instead of evil-doers, whether the fatherless and the widow have not been sent weeping to their heavenly Father to complain of injustice. It is not a time to cover faults, but to confess and leave them, lest unavoidable ruin come upon us when it will be too late. 17. A 17th sin of London is covetousness. How universally hath this sin reigned in the city, so that it may almost be said of London as it was of Jerusalem, Jeremiah 6, verse 13, from the least of them even unto the greatest of them, every one is given to covetousness. Those who have been freed from gluttony, drunkenness, adultery, and the like expensive sins, have on the other hand addicted themselves to the sin of covetousness. I do not charge all, but oh, how almost universal hath this sin among tradesmen been, which hath evidenced itself both in their getting and keeping riches. First, in getting, what eager desires after the world, and their obtaining an estate by their trades, what studies and consultations, what racking the brains and torturing the wits to find out the best way of thriving in the world. What earnest prosecutions have there been, and laborious endeavours, rising up early and sitting up late, and wearying the body and the mind all the day, eating the bread of carefulness, and mingling the drink with solicitousness, crowding up the whole time with worldly business, so that their own health hath been disregarded, as well as the worship of God neglected in the families of these worldlings, and all to scrape a little worldly riches together, which some have missed of, notwithstanding all their endeavours, and if they have obtained, yet they have remained more poor in contentment than when they were more poor in their estates. For as their estates have increased, so their desires have increased, and been farther off from satisfaction. As they have enlarged their shops and trades, and wealth hath flowed in upon them, so they have enlarged their desires like hell, and like the grave have never said, It is enough. When they have added bag to bag and house to house, the more cares and fears, and sometimes piercing sorrows have accompanied their gains. But far have they been from finding the contentment and comfort in their riches that they looked for. Second, this covetousness hath appeared in keeping what they have gotten. Keeping, I say, for covetous persons have had little heart to spend, though in necessary uses, what they have scraped together, they have had wealth, but the use of it they have not had. It hath been to them like a treasure in a chest, of which they had lost the key, or like another man's money in their keeping, which they must not meddle withal. Whatever abundance they have had in the bag and in the coffer, their families have been in want, the table hath been penurious, the back and belly have been pinched, they have lived at a meaner rate than those that have been of a meaner degree. The poor might starve at their doors, no pity towards others in want and misery, and the least pity towards themselves, whilst they have been saving, for fear lest afterwards they should want. They have all along wanted, whilst they have been saving, and it may be at last they have lost what they have been keeping to the unexpressible grief, and it may be breaking of their hearts, which have been so set upon these things. This sin of covetousness in some hath had deeper rooting, in most hath been had too much footing, and in all hath been very heinous and abominable before God. This sin is termed idolatry in Scripture, and the covetous are stigmatized with the name of idolaters, Colossians 3 verse 5, Ephesians 5 verse 5. It is heart idolatry, forbidden in the first commandment. That thing we make a god to ourselves, which we chiefly affect. If it be the world, then we make the world our God, which is inconsistent with the true love of God, the Father, the only true God. 1 John 2 verse 25, Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. This sin of covetousness is hateful to God, and provokes his wrath. Isaiah 57 verse 17, For the iniquity of his covetousness was I wroth, and smote him. Hath not God smitten London with the plague and fire, among other iniquities, for this iniquity of covetousness? When London was eagerly pursuing after the world, and all minding and seeking their own interest, without any regard to the interest of God's glory and kingdom, or care of their sole interest and salvation, which their worldly business would not allow time for, did not the Lord send a plague to put a stop to their trade, and gave them time to seek him, and to make their peace with him in their retirements, which they could not, or rather would not find before. And when they returned with more eagerness to their trades after the plague was a little over, that they might fetch up, if they could, what they had missed by that intermission, did not the Lord send a fire to consume much of that which they had set their hearts upon, and in large legible letters write vanity upon this idol, which so many had worshipped. Let London consider and lay to heart this sin of covetousness. 18. The 18th sin of London is extortion. Thus covetousness hath expressed itself more grossly in some. I shall not here discourse concerning usury, but the extorting use which some have taken of those who have been in want, the taking use upon use, and grinding the faces of the poor in their distress, no doubt is a great sin, and very offensive to God. How many extortioners have there been in London who have enriched themselves by impoverishing of others, who, panting after the dust of the earth, on the head of the poor, have lent money to them, not for their help, but to catch them at an advantage, that so, without mercy, they might catch away all that they had, not leaving them so much as a bed to lie on. Thus some have been like lions for cruelty, and like evening wolves unto the poor, tearing their flesh from their bones, and reserving their very bones to gnaw in the morning, as the prophet speaks, Zephaniah 3 verse 3. This sin of extortion was one of the abominations reckoned up by the prophet Ezekiel, for which God was so highly offended with Jerusalem, chapter 22 verse 12. Thou hast taken usury and increase, and hast greedily gained of thy neighbour by extortion, and hast forgotten me. For this and other sins there mentioned, it is said, verse 3, Therefore have I poured out my indignation upon them, I have consumed them with the fire of my wrath. Unto this sin of extortion I may add several other ways that many in the city have had in getting estates, which some may dispute for the lawfulness of, and because so common and gainful the sin is little heeded, but when the Lord hath been contending with the whole city, and hath inflicted a general stroke upon tradesmen, yea, one stroke upon another, and hath trodden their trade under his feet, as seeming to be offended with something therein, methinks they should be awakened, and open their eyes, and impartially search and labour to find out whatever it is that doth offend him, whatever seeming disadvantage may come to them thereby, and if they will not hearken, God can take away the remainder, as he hath done a great part, and so force them to a sense of their sin. One sinful way of getting estates, and I am persuaded displeasing to God, is engrossing and monopolizing of commodities, which many in London have done, that having all the commodities of that kind in their hands, they might make their own market, and set their own price upon them, which, if they sold as cheap as otherwise they would do, or as others do when they are shared into many hands, as possibly some say, I could not condemn the thing, but when, by getting the whole into their hands, they hoist and raise the price far beyond the just value, which they necessitate people to give, and that only that they might enrich themselves, this I dare confidently affirm to be unlawful, and my reason is because hereby they prefer a lesser good before a greater, namely the enriching of themselves and their families before the more public good of making the commodity more cheap to the commonwealth. If they say the injury which they who buy of it will sustain, they being so many, will be very small and inconsiderable, but the good they shall get hereby will be great, and they may be in a better capacity of doing good, I answer that none ought to do the least injury for the reaping of the greatest advantage, it being absolutely unlawful to do evil, that good may come thereby, and the damnation of such will be just, Romans 3 verse 8, and consequently a greater injury will come to themselves than to those whom they injure. Yea, the injury will be greater than the good which they obtain. And as for their being in a capacity of doing more good, I believe that such persons, if they do spend such gains, are more forward to spend them on their lusts than to lay them out on charitable uses. I have not heard that the greatest monopolizers in London have been the most charitable persons. If I were more acquainted with the mysteries of trades in the city, I fear I might find out more than one mystery of iniquity among them. If the Lord would put into the hearts of magistrates and citizens to look into trades, and to consider the equity that they bear, and take some course for rectifying abuses in them, it might be one way to obtain a more favourable aspect from heaven, and the Lord might revive again the trade of London, which now is dying and sinking to the ground. 19. A 19th sin of London is lying. It is said of Nineveh, Nahum 3 verse 1, that it was a city full of lies. all the lies that have been in London, who can reckon them? Lies in the streets, loud lies which have been cried, false news which we daily hear, lies in the chambers, secret lies, privy false tales which are whispered in the ears, lies in the shop, trading lies, lies told in buying and selling, officious lies which some tell to do their friends a kindness, mischievous lies which some tell to do another an injury. We read of some that bend their tongue like their bow for lies, that will not speak the truth, but teach their tongue to speak lies. Jeremiah 9 verses 3 and 5. How many liars have there been in London? What age is free from this sin? The children have learned to lie as soon as they have learned to speak. What house hath been free? How have tradesmen been guilty of lying, which some account a necessary adjunct to their trade, without which they could not live? How many servants have excused one another and themselves when they have committed faults with their lies? But of all lies, mischievous lies hath been the worst, which some have invented to do an injury to their neighbour. Such lies are more immediately begotten by the devil, the father of lies, and such liars are his most genuine offspring. But all lies, in a sense, are mischievous lies. They are mischievous to the party that tells them. Even the officious liar cannot do so much kindness to his friend by his lie as he doth injury to himself. What, will a man stab himself to do his friend a courtesy? He that wounds his conscience doth worse. He that gains in his trade by his lie loseth more than he gains. A bag of gold is not to be compared with inward peace, and the favour of God better than life, which by this sin is lost. Surely the Lord, being a God of truth, is much offended with this sin of lying. God delights, saith Solomon, in them that deal truly, but lying lips are an abomination to him. Proverbs 12 verse 22. Lying was one sin of Israel, for which their land did mourn. Hosea 14 verses 2 and 3. And God threateneth to give all liars their part in that lake which burneth with fire and brimstone. Revelation 21 verse 8. Methinks that one place should make all liars tremble. And is not this one sin which some professors in the city have been guilty of, to the shame of their profession, for which the Lord hath sent the fire to burn down the city, to awaken us to fly from this sin, as we would escape the future fire of hell? 20. Another sin of London is cozening and defrauding. This sin hath been the product of covetousness, and the companion of lying, and how ordinary hath it been among tradesmen, which many have been so accustomed to, that it hath been as easy to persuade the Ethiopian to change his skin, as to persuade them to leave off their cozening. This that they have looked upon as even essential to their trade, at least as necessary to their gains. Yea, some have pleaded a necessity thereof, to get a livelihood for themselves and families. But there is no necessity of any sin. Duties are necessary, but sins are never necessary, and the gain which is gotten by sin is like the gain of a garment which hath the plague in it, which, if it bring warmth for the present, quickly also may bring sickness and death. And if cozening brings gain into the purse, it presently brings the plague into the heart, and quickly will bring the pain and punishment of hell. To defraud another in dealing is but a more covert way of stealing, and it is as lawful to take a purse upon the highway as to take a shilling by fraud in the shop. The difference lies only in the degree. The nature of the sin, which is theft, is the same in both, and the Lord, as he hath expressly forbidden this sin, so he threateneth to avenge it. 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 6, that no man go beyond or defraud his brother, not only in a greater thing, but in any matter, because the Lord is the avenger of all such. The several ways which tradesmen have had of defrauding would be too large for me to speak of, neither am I so skilful as to understand. The falsifying of weights and measures is gross, a sin practised among the Jews of old, which God threatens to punish them for. Hosea 12 verse 7, Ephraim is a merchant, the balances of deceit are in his hand. And both their sin and God's anger are set forth, Micah 6 verses 10, 11, 12, and 13. Are there yet the treasures of wickedness in the houses of the wicked, and the scant measure which is abominable? Shall I count them pure with the wicked balances, and with the bag of deceitful weights? For the rich men thereof are full of violence, and the inhabitants thereof have spoken lies, and their tongue is deceitful in their mouth. Therefore also will I make thee sick in smiting thee, in making thee desolate because of thy sins. And was it not thus with London? Did they not falsify weights and measures, and falsify commodities, and speak falsely concerning the price of them, and take unconscionable gains, and yet possess kind usage of their customers, whom they did not most exact upon? But if I could, I should not open the cunning ways which some have found out of defrauding and overreaching, lest any should learn and be enticed to practice the sin by the very reproof of it, as I have heard some have done. Now such persons who have gotten their wealth by defrauding and overreaching their brethren bring themselves into such a snare of the devil that very few ever get out, but are dragged by him thereby into hell, because it is not bare grieving for this sin which is necessary to the obtaining of a pardon, but restitution is necessary. They must refund, they must restore, either to the parties themselves or to the poor, what they have gotten wrongfully, if they be able, if not, as much as they have, otherwise they cannot be saved. No salvation came to Zacchaeus till he was resolved upon restitution of what he had wrongfully gained. Luke 19, verses 8 and 9. God smites his hand at dishonest gain. Ezekiel 21, verse 13, and this is one sin which I believe God hath smitten London for. 21. A farther sin of London is prodigality and profuse spending. Some have spared too much through covetousness, others have spent too much through prodigality. Liberality is a great virtue, and bountiful charity an excellent grace, which London hath not been without. But prodigality is a great sin. Thus some have spent above their degree, lavishing out their estates on their tables, on their houses, on their clothes. But the worst prodigality hath been in that which men have lavished out in the satisfaction of their lusts, in drunkenness, gaming, whoring, and the like, and especially those who have spent profusely that which hath been none of their own, but what they have taken up on credit of others, have been most grossly guilty of this sin. And unto this sin of prodigality and profuseness I may refer the sin of excessive mirth and jollity, which hath been in London. There is an harmless mirth which is lawful, and there is a spiritual cheerfulness which is the duty of Christians, though in times of great sin and affliction of God's people, sackcloth and mourning doth become Christians, and some expressions of joy which are more carnal should be much forborne. But I am speaking of the mirth of such who have had the least ground for mirth of any, namely the wicked, unto whom no peace nor joy in that estate doth belong. For them to be so excessively merry and jovial and frolic, expressing it in their profane, obscene, and scurrilous jesting, in their music, singing, and dancing, in their ranting, roaring, and carousing, in many wasteful and profuse ways of spending, when the church is in sackcloth and lies a-bleeding, as too many in London have done. Surely God hath been offended with this, and hath been provoked to send down his judgments, to alter the cheer of London, and hereby to put them into mourning, which they were so averse unto. Had they foreseen the plague, and how many of them should have fallen by it, surely it would have damped their mirth. Had they foreseen the burning of the city of London, and that their houses should have fallen by the fire, surely their laughter would have been turned into heaviness. These judgments they could not foresee, but future judgments, far more dreadful, they might have foreseen, which should have made an impression of sorrow upon them, if possibly by repentance they might avoid and escape it. Be afflicted, and mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning, and your joy into heaviness. James 4, verse 9. Such mourning, if for sin, might be a means to prevent future miseries and eternal woe and weeping. Others they have reason to mourn for, those miseries which will come upon them. Go to now, ye rich men, weep and howl for the miseries that shall come upon you. James 5, verse 1. But for profane, wicked persons to sing and rejoice just upon the brink of the grave and hell is very unseasonable, and an aggravation of their other sins. 22. Another offence is envying, and this sin was to be found not only in women, which envied others that exceeded them in beauty of body, in clothes and dressing and such like toys, but also in men, who envied them who were of the same trade, which had better houses and shops, more custom and wealth than themselves, as Hesiod, que gera mevs, gera mi colli, que tectoni teclon, que plochos plocho, phthonei, que audos audo. Yea, this envying was to be found among many ministers, who envied others that had better parts and more learning, greater applause and more auditors than themselves. There was a spirit among us which lusted to envy. James 4 verse 5, which, besides the great torment that it brings to the spirit where it reigns, is a very great provocation to the Lord. 23. There was also slandering and backbiting, which hath been the consequent of the former. The 9th commandment hath been exceedingly broke in London, especially in a private way of bearing false witness against the neighbour, and wounding his reputation by a slanderous tongue. Some inventing lies and raising slanders, which they have in their consciences known to be false, others taking up slanders, readily believing them without any just proof. This sin you have set forth, with a caution to take heed of such persons, Jeremiah 9 verses 4 and 5. London hath been full of backbiters and tale-bearers, and too many professors have been guilty of this sin. Few have entertained backbiters with an angry countenance, which, as the wind driveth away rain, would have driven them out of sight. I might here add the hatred of one another that hath been in London, much through slanders, the emulation that hath arisen from hatred, the wrath that hath arisen from emulation, and the wrath of God, which hath arisen from these and other works of the flesh, spoken of Galatians 5, verses 19 and 20. 24. The next is murmuring, and that not only in wants and under losses and crosses, but also in fullness and plenty. Many farmers in the country have murmured at the plenty and cheapness of corn. Many tradesmen in the city have murmured at the plenty of the commodities which they have dealt in, because, however, such plenty is a public and unspeakable mercy, yet they have had the less private advantage which hath been chiefly regarded by them. Yea, some in their murmuring have wished for a plague, that the survivors might have the better trade, and I have heard that a fire also hath been wished for, to take off the plenty of such commodities, that the remainder might bear the higher rate. Is it a wonder then if God have sent plague and fire, which some have called for by such murmuring speeches? The Israelites in the wilderness were plagued for their murmuring, and the murmuring company of Korah, that were not swallowed up with him, were consumed by a fire from heaven. 25. The last sin of London which I shall speak of is carnal security, another of Sodom's sins. It is said of the Sodomites, Luke 17 verses 28 and 29, in the days of Lot they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded, but the same day that Lot went out of Sodom it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. When London had provoked God so highly by so many sins, yet how secure were they before his judgments broke forth upon them. They ate and drank, they bought and sold, etc. They sat at ease, and put far from them the evil day, as Amos 6. They were still and at rest, little expecting such changes as have come upon them, and taking little care to prevent them. They were secure, and trusted in arms of flesh, broken reeds which have always failed. And I might add here, as a cause of the security of some, the presumptuous confidences of future events, which belong only to God to foreknow, which some have taken upon them so absolutely to determine, as if they had looked into the book of God's decrees, or had an infallible revelation from him of what should come to pass. Oh, the good days that some have looked for, upon the presumption of what they had no ground for. Great expectations many had of the fall of Antichrist in Babylon in the year 1666, and other events, limiting times which God hath not clearly revealed, which is an entrenching upon God's prerogative, and I believe a greater provocation than such persons are aware of. This may be one reason why London is fallen instead of Babylon in this year of such expectation and presumption. By this time it may be the reader may be wearied with reading, as I am with thinking and writing of London's sins. But how hath the Lord been wearied with the bearing of them? How hath he been pressed with the weight of them, as a cart is pressed that is full of sheaves? Amos 2 verse 13. If, when you have read of London's sins, withal you consider London's provocations, you must needs acknowledge that God is righteous, in that he hath punished London no more than they have deserved for these sins. End of section 15.